Thank you for good to see some of you again. My name is Ngofen Putubuele. I am the host of the podcast, and I'm moderating the session. Human Rights Watch isn't just doing research and advocacy. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes work to help folks that are going through various situations, uplifting their voices. And we're hoping in this session you get to hear what some of that work is like and what it entails. So I'm just going to let everyone introduce themselves really quickly and then start with a couple questions. So I'm Ngofen.
I'm Stacy Sullivan. I'm the Communications Director at Human Rights Watch, based in New York.
I'm Tanya Lokshina, Europe and Central Asia Associate Director. I used to run the Russia office for Human Rights Watch for many years, but they shut us down, and I'm now based in Tbilisi, Georgia. That's not the American state of Georgia, but rather the Southern Caucasus.
And I'm Fereshta Abbasi. I am the Afghanistan researcher for Human Rights Watch, based in the UK.
Amazing. And regionally, like our focus here in this conversation will mainly be Afghanistan, Russia, Belarus, just contextually, so you know. So first question, Fereshta and Tanya. So you both work in countries where activists aren't really in a position to voice their opposition publicly or fight for their rights. What are you hearing from the partners that you work with? And how does Human Rights Watch support them in that context?
It's really a good question. I have never actually been asked, because we're usually being asked questions about the research that we do. So most of the interviews that I do, and then most of the questions that I usually answer is around the sort of work that we do with the research. But research is actually one part of the work that we do. It's not all what we do. So I'm glad to be able to speak a little bit more about the behind the scenes of this. And I would like to begin with a story to contextualize it on how we work with human rights groups on the ground. Last year, August 2024, was the third anniversary of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. And it was the whole anniversary, era and atmosphere is it's very emotional for our Afghanistan team, for me, personally as a woman from Afghanistan. And we were, in every year, it's sort of a reminder that what is HRW's added value? What should we be doing differently? And how we can do something to change things on the ground. And in August, I was like, well, we have reported on the humanitarian crisis. We have reported on the extrajudicial killings, on the freedom of speech, on the arbitrary detention, all of these. Nothing is happening on the ground. People are still starving. People are still subjected to all these abuses by the Taliban. And I was like, okay, so what can we do outside this sphere? And one thing that came to my mind at the time was like, 3 years on, it's time to hold the Taliban accountable for what they're doing. We've given them enough space. We have compromised enough. We have called for engagement with the Taliban in the hope that they will compromise and reverse the bans, but they're clearly not doing it. So let's hold them accountable. How can we hold them accountable? I took a step back, and then I went through what the Afghan civil society wants. We had so many consultation meetings with the civil society, and one of the biggest advocacy calls for Afghanistan, for the Afghanistan civil society for years, had been to have an independent mechanism that can document human rights violations up to a standard that could be used in a court of law. That was something, it was a huge gap for Afghanistan, and nobody was doing that. Nobody was identifying perpetrators. So for the past 3 years, we kept saying that the Taliban are doing this and that, but who is the Taliban actually? Who within the Taliban leadership is responsible for all these abuses? Who is implementing them? And if you ever want to take them to a court of law, you need to have the evidence to connect the particular crime to an individual, and that was missing. So I spoke with these networks of human rights defenders in exile and in the country, and we agreed that we will support them, we will uplift their voice, and I decided, I was like, we will launch a campaign as big as as huge to make sure that all the diplomats are hearing us. This is what we want for Afghanistan right now. I had lots of hope, and I'm always accused to be the last optimist person in the room because I mean, even though like situation is really grim, it is difficult to stay hopeful for Afghanistan. September 2024 was the Human Rights Council, which is based in Geneva and is the institution within the UN who is responsible to establish these mechanisms. I went to Geneva in September. We launched a huge campaign. 13 international organizations, more than 70 local organizations, Afghan organizations, 90 together, pushing for an accountability mechanism for Afghanistan. And we never thought, me and my Geneva colleagues, we never thought that it will reach to that point. The sound and the pressure was as big as it was impossible for the diplomats to not hear us. We launched, we arranged briefings in Geneva. I spoke in 7 side events in Geneva calling for the mechanism. I did briefings with the diplomats, bilateral meetings with the UN, with the diplomats. And then in November, I went back, speaking on a different conference, still calling for the mechanism. This March, for the International Women's Day, we, Human Rights Watch, co-hosted a screening of a film by an Afghan filmmaker in Geneva. And of course, we used that to, again, shame the diplomats for not giving this mechanism that Afghanistan is very, very much needs at the time. And right now that I'm speaking with you here and I'm sitting here, I actually received a text from my Geneva colleague because she's still arranging briefings for the civil society to meet with the EU diplomats. And this huge campaign is still ongoing. It's HRW is co-leading this campaign with the HRD Plus, which is called the Human Rights Defender Plus Network for Afghanistan. And the accountability, the idea of accountability for Afghans, it has been a long wish, but we never thought that we can get this close. And this is the first time that Afghanistan has been as close as to getting a mechanism in its history ever. And just like 20 minutes earlier, my colleague sent me a text and she says, Fereshta, I think we're actually getting the mechanism. So I am going to go to Geneva in June to support and uplift the voices of Afghan civil society, because this is what they want, and we are listening to them and we are supporting them.
Fereshta, amazing. Yeah. Tanya, go ahead if you want to.
Yeah. Look, where to start? I work primarily on 3 countries. One of them is Russia. The other one is Belarus. Equally depressing, maybe even more so. The third one is Ukraine. And I only work on Ukraine in context of the war and the war crimes. So it's all doom and gloom, right? At the same time, with all these 3 countries, we've been partnering with local organizations for years and years. And in fact, when Human Rights Watch launched its own global partnership campaign, which was, I don't know, a few years ago, and different staff members were being asked, do you have any partnership experience? I was genuinely like, what? Meaning that some people within the organization don't? Like, this is how we worked year in, year out, all the time. And when I just started out as a Russia researcher, which was back in, 2008, right? Russian organizations knew quite well how to work with the European Court on Human Rights, but they did not know enough about the UN human rights protection mechanisms. They did not know enough about the International Criminal Court and the issues with prosecutions for crimes against humanity under universal jurisdiction, meaning like in third countries. And this is something that we were in a position to actually explain to them. So not only we were doing joint research projects and joint advocacy, but we were actually doing some capacity building. And that was true for both Russia and Belarus. Well, right now, Russian and Belarusian human rights organizations are very advocacy savvy, and they're very research savvy. Does it mean that they don't need us anymore? Well, no, that's definitely not the case. Because in a situation of an unprecedented, vicious human rights crackdown, where the governments in both Russia and Belarus are attempting to effectively eviscerate all forms of dissent. What our partners really need is for HRW to talk about them and their plight and their situation, because they don't find it appropriate to talk about themselves. It's deeply uncomfortable. They want to focus on their work on behalf of the victims. They want to focus on the victims, and they leave it to us to talk about them. And just to give you an example, recently we published a huge report, may I have the slide, called Legislative Minefield in Russia. And what it is about are different pieces of legislation which the Kremlin very conveniently pushed through the parliament to make life absolutely impossible for Russian civil society. The law on foreign agents that stigmatizes Russian groups as spies and traitors, the law on undesirable organizations that applies to foreign organizations which collaborate with Russian organizations, and the government now has the capacity to ban them and to prosecute people for collaborating with those organizations. By the way, yesterday, the Kremlin banned Amnesty International as undesirable. So we're being very apprehensive here, because if, God forbid, we also end up on the list, it's going to create some problems for our partners with regard to engaging with us directly. Right? I guess we have new slides. That's not a problem. It was just a report cover, really. I'll Google it for anyone who wants to see it later on. Same goes with Belarusian human rights defenders, right? So in Belarus, one of the things that the government did after the mass public protests of 2020, when Alexander Lukashenko, who's been president of Belarus for 28 years, almost got ousted and would have been ousted if not for the support of his big brother, Mr. Putin, Belarusian authorities decided to annihilate the legal profession as such. And they adopted all sorts of draconian legislation and measures to make sure that lawyers no longer dare take on cases of politically motivated prosecutions. Because those who do, they're very likely to be prosecuted alongside with their clients as part of the same criminal organizations. And we did a major report on the situation of Belarusian lawyers, and we pushed it in the European Union in particular, asking for funding, asking for visas, asking for support. And speaking about human rights defenders in both Russia and Belarus, our key priority, in addition to research, is actually making sure that they get the support that they need. In Belarus, for example, the exiles are banned from renewing their passports and other documents in the consulates. In order to get their documents renewed, they have to return to Belarus. That's a new law. And those who returned to Belarus because they were in desperate situation, they couldn't travel, right? They couldn't do anything. They immediately got prosecuted. So what we did, we really pushed some European governments and the European Union as an organization to issue them something called travelers' passports, which are basically white passports, foreigners' passports, that they can use freely to travel within Europe. This is something that is actually happening right now, and we are very proud of it. Likewise, Russian human rights defenders, many of them had to leave the country, just like the Belarusians had to leave their country. Some stayed on the ground, however, they still continue with their work. Those who are still on the ground, they need to travel on a regular basis. They need to be able to get on a plane in an emergency situation, stat, right? They need to be able to travel to different international fora to stay on top of the agenda, to engage directly with international actors. They need to travel in order to be able to communicate with their colleagues overseas. However, because of the anti-Russia sanctions, they're generally treated like your regular Russian nationals when they apply for a visa. Russian nationals are not welcome, so we have to go to each and every embassy, to each and every international organization and argue their cases. Also, U.S. funding freeze. Oh my God. HRW does not accept governmental money, so we're not affected directly, right? All of our local partners, all of them, lost from 50 to 90% of their respective budgets due to the U.S. funding freeze. And what we are doing is running around and doing our utmost to make sure that donors actually pay attention and that they get the funds that they desperately need to continue with their work. Now, with Ukrainian human rights defenders, we work very closely with them on everything and anything related to Russia's horrendous war on Ukraine. We do research together, we do advocacy together, and we also campaign together. And one of the things that we've been doing during the past 3 months, which I personally find very gratifying, is this project called People First. The slides are working. Okay, let's go further. People First. Yes. The other one, the previous one. People First. So when Donald Trump got elected and started talking about ending the war in 1 day, in 3 days, in whatever, very quickly, I mean, it was crystal clear that he would not be able to end the war in 1 day. However, the discourse about potential negotiations, potential end of fighting became very high on the international agenda. And along with our Ukrainian partners and Russian partners, we're actually quite shocked that everyone was talking about territories, compromises on territories, how far Russian occupation would extend, how much Putin would be willing to compromise, how much Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, would be willing to give up. What about sanctions, American sanctions, European sanctions? You know what no one was talking about among the key international interlocutors? No one was talking about people, about tens of thousands of captives of the war, all those thousands of Ukrainian civilian detainees held in Russian prisons without any legal status, without access to lawyers, in horrendous conditions, tortured on a daily basis. No one talked about them. Ukrainian prisoners of war, not civilian detainees, but rather combatants, held in the same appalling conditions, tortured. According to the recent findings by the UN Commission of Inquiry, 80% of Ukrainian POWs in Russian captivities, prisoners of war in Russian captivities, have been subjected to sexualized violence on top of everything else. Torture with electric shocks, beatings, humiliation, you name it. No one was talking about them. Thousands of Ukrainian children deported to Russia. No one was talking about them at the time. And also you've got Russian prisoners of war in Ukraine. And on top of that, there are Russian political prisoners who were prosecuted and imprisoned specifically because of their anti-war stance and action. They're also captives of the war, right? And so we got together with leading Ukrainian, Russian, and international rights groups and organized this campaign, trying to explain to all the key international actors that people have to come first. And actually many of them, unfortunately not Putin yet, but quite a lot of them picked up our message. And the issue of people, of captives of the war, is now very prominent in the media and very prominent in all sorts of Ukraine-related international negotiations. And lastly, and I'm going to stop here because I've been talking too much, it's very difficult for Russian and Ukrainian human rights groups to take part in the same public events, to sit at the same table because of the political stigma relevant for the Ukrainian colleagues, right? Russia is the enemy, they are likely to face problems if they sit at the same table, if they do the same press conference with their Russian colleagues. Yes, they cooperate on a daily basis, but they kind of do it low profile. Publicly, it's a problem. Sitting together at the same event is a problem. They can be criticized back in Ukraine. They can get in trouble with their own government. So what we do, we sit in the middle. We act as moderators of those events. We officially bring them together. We are the organizers. They are the speakers. And it works like a charm for everyone.
It's really interesting to hear about the different sort of kind of work that you're doing. Stacy, I'm curious, in the communications team, you lead that. How does this work of uplifting voices show up?
Well, I think we, as Human Rights Watch, which is an organization of about 500 people that works in about 100 countries, has a collective social media following in multiple languages of 40 million. We have contacts with journalists all around the world and with op-ed editors all around the world. We're in a position where we can provide the support to elevate voices from, say, Russia and Afghanistan. Like, we have the connections that they don't. And we have the expertise as well to do that. So if Tanya or Fereshta has worked on a report, I can have a look at the report, and buried in there will be incredible stories of really brave people who have done extraordinary things, whose voices we can uplift. And one recent example was, I think this came up in a conversation with you, Fereshta, and Patty. She kind of casually, Fereshta did a report on the plight of police women, women who had worked as police in Afghanistan. And they were deeply stigmatized after that. And after the U.S. and its allies left, these women were basically abandoned. And I mean, they had actually suffered quite a lot as police women in Afghanistan, from sexual abuse to everything else, and then were just completely abandoned and had to go into hiding. And Fereshta just mentioned on the phone, like, one of them, she managed to get out and then went through the Darien Gap and then ended up in Maryland, and was working like at an Amazon warehouse and a couple of other jobs. And I was just like, okay, I think this is probably a story that we can work with this. And so we worked with her, and we drafted an op-ed, which was, we had to do it under a pseudonym. So that meant, like, some op-ed pages wouldn't, because her family would have been in danger in Afghanistan. Some op-ed pages won't run a piece that's written by someone with a pseudonym, but we ended up placing it in The Hill. So there was a great first-person piece about her journey and how important it was to protect the women who served in the Afghan police forces and what the U.S. owed them. And then I said to Gofen and Curtis, the producer of our podcast, there's this amazing former policewoman from Afghanistan who managed to get out and then, went through the Darien Gap and is now in Maryland. And so she doesn't speak English, or she spoke some English, but really wasn't comfortable speaking in English on the podcast. So we would do an interview with her did you translate for it? With Fereshta, and it was, choppy, an hour and a half. It was hard to pin her down because she had 3 jobs at an Amazon warehouse and elsewhere, and we finally get her. And then, thanks to Gofen's writing and Curtis's amazing editing, we've made a beautiful podcast. It's called Why Do People Move? About refugees and why it's important, the reasons that refugees are seeking asylum. Sometimes they're very often very real, like not being able to go back to Afghanistan, and turned it into a really lovely, accessible podcast, which was another way to raise a local a voice from Afghanistan. And this is the kind of stuff that we do regularly whenever we can. We will find someone's story and then use our resources to give that person a voice.
Thank you. And I'll just add sort of the end of that chain. For me, I received sort of the task as the podcast host of, okay, this is the story that we want to tell. And there's a very specific way, and maybe it's a bit nerdy, that I think about uplifting voices when we're doing audio stories. So part of our job is to translate a super complex experience that has legal implications, that has social implications, into something that people can listen to for 20, 30 minutes and sort of like get the heart of it. And the small technical thing that's part of that that's really fun for me when we think about uplifting voices is actually literally just hearing the person's voice. So if you think about when you listen to NPR, BBC, any major news, typically when you hear someone speaking in a foreign language, you'll hear about 2 seconds of the person, and then the translator comes over them. And so literally, as an audio person, I think it sometimes feels like a pity because we're trying to amplify the voice, but we literally cover the voice. But then also, you need to translate, because otherwise we can't hear what they're saying. And so on the podcast team, which is part of communications, we think a lot about the balance between hearing the voice of the original language and the translator, and trying to space it out. Sometimes it does go over, but sometimes when we can, we try to space it out. Or sometimes you can hear what they're saying emotionally, even if you don't know the words. And so it's a really, really sort of like laser-focused thing that's about amplifying the voices so that we can literally hear what they're saying. Even if you might not know exactly what they're saying, you can sort of feel it. One of the questions that I have that comes up on the podcast, and I'm sure across the board, is how do you try to make sure that people that you're working with aren't put at risk? Because as you mentioned, like the situations are risky, and you mentioned sort of being the moderator. What are some of the tools or situations that come up where you have to think about that? So anyone can answer.
So, I mean, you brought up the example of podcast very well. We work quite a lot with the civil society networks. It is impossible for us. I mean, it is impossible to do this sort of work without having networks on the ground and outside. So basically, we work very closely with human rights defenders, local rights defenders. I mean, in the context of Afghanistan, there is this massive new wave of Afghan women's rights movements. They are female protesters who used to be librarians, who used to be people who never wanted to be political in that sense. Because, I mean, I have interviewed so many of them, and they're telling me that they never wanted to be a protester. They never wanted to come out. But then when the Taliban took over and all their rights had been taken away from them, they are protesting now, and they are sort of pushed into a new era. So, I mean, one of the things that is at the forefront of Human Rights Watch work is the principle of do not harm. So we really ensure that we're not putting anyone's safety at risk. Whatever we do, that's the first top question for our Afghanistan work. Like, whatever I do, the first question I'm asking is it safe to do? Is it, if it begins with the documentation, if you're supposed to do research, if I'm meant to interview somebody in the country or outside, the first question I ask myself is it safe to do, not only for myself, but also for the person that I'm talking to, for their family members, because sometimes you can speak to some rights defenders outside Afghanistan, they still have people inside. So we need to be really sure about that. That's probably, you don't hear much about who our partners are. So we speak a lot about our partners on the ground, our networks on the ground, but you don't really know, like, there aren't names and faces to that, because we don't want to put anyone's safety at risk. Those who are inside Afghanistan, wherever I go, I usually say that we need to leave a seat for the voiceless defenders, because they don't have a voice. They are silenced at this point. There is no picture, there is no name, there is no identity, they have nothing. And even the podcast that we did is under pseudonym. I mean, she chose her name. She chose to be called Hannah all over the podcast. And there were places that, I mean, naturally as an individual, she's this fantastic women's rights defender who is still advocating for her colleagues to be resettled somewhere outside Afghanistan because they're at risk. She kept calling her name. And then I wrote back to Goffin Goffin and Curtis, and I was like, she told her real name. Can you make sure that you edit that out?
Yeah,
So
she
cut
kept
it
using her
out,
real name in the interview,
right?
and then we had
because
to
that's
cut it,
natural.
yeah.
I mean, I speak, and then I say my name. So I think that's why we're very careful about this. So, I mean, with the network that I work very closely in Geneva, and I have been like sort of fully invested since last September, and I'm really hoping I actually will go back in June to Geneva to push for this. The 70 plus organization that I mentioned, we only know the logos. And we don't really talk about who the founders are. At some point, actually, EU diplomats, I keep bringing EU because EU is, in Geneva, EU is responsible for, every country has, sort of every profile has somebody who is responsible for them. So the Afghanistan profile is with the EU right now in Geneva. So that's why we keep going to them. And we are like, it is your responsibility to respond to the crisis. And as part of that, you need to give Afghanistan a mechanism that can investigate and document rights abuses there. So EU came back to us because, I mean, they were really under a lot of pressure. So we managed to establish a group, a regional group in Geneva, because EU was not listening to us, right? They were under pressure, but they kept saying, well, there's no money. And then now, I mean, there's the new change in the US administration. We don't have any budget to give anything to Afghanistan. And then we went to the countries that we thought are aligned with us. So South Africa, Chile, France, Czech, and there are quite a few others who we spoke with, and we created this regional group. And then we said, and they kept calling for this mechanism, which made it difficult for EU to not respond to that, right? And then EU came back and said that, well, it is Human Rights Watch's campaign. It's not what the Afghan civil society wants, because we were at the forefront. We were the face. I was the person that kept going to the EU diplomats. And at this point, I believe that the EU diplomats hate to see me in Geneva, because I don't ever miss an opportunity to shame them of not doing what is right for Afghanistan. And I mean, there was a panel earlier in this, in the same room where we spoke, where a question was raised about the joy. I enjoy when I see I'm making diplomats uncomfortable, because that's where I feel like, okay, fine, this is where I need to push you because you're not doing your job. You're not doing enough. So they came back and they said, well, it's HRW's campaign. You are all over the place. And it's not the Afghan rights defenders. It's not the plight of Afghan rights defender. So I had to go back to the network and say, we are in this situation. Is there anybody who is willing to speak with the EU? And we went back to the EU. We arranged a whole panel for Afghan rights defenders who were supposed to speak on this sort of mechanism. And I'm not going to get into the technicality of that, because we drafted position papers. We translated that into Dari and Pashto, which are the local languages in Afghanistan. We wanted these Afghan advocates to be fully equipped and go and speak and then defend what they think is right for Afghanistan. And then we went back to the EU and we said that on the basis of confidentiality, we're offering you a whole panel of Afghan civil society activists who are going to defend this. This is not Human Rights Watch's advocacy call only. This is what they want. And then we did 2 briefings, one after another. Actually, one is happening on Friday. We did 2 earlier, and then there is one that is scheduled for Friday, which they wanted me to be there because they kept texting me, these rights defenders and the local rights defender. They were like, you need to be there. They're going to raise questions. I texted them back and I said, hey, I'm in Canada. I'm in a different time zone. I have faith in all of you. I'm going to send you talking points. And that's how it works, because otherwise it is not easy to get a meeting with EU. EU responds to Human Rights Watch, but not to a local network who wants something. So, I mean, the whole campaign in Geneva at this point is sort of, we are, campaigning. Yes, we are co-leading it. And I always use the word co-leading. Actually at Human Rights Watch, we're not really used to say, it's always we. Well, I'm the only Afghanistan researcher. We don't have a big Afghanistan team. So when I say we are doing it, I really mean myself. But but I mean, yes. So this is like. So we do a lot of these things, and then, I mean, I agree with Tanya. We moderate, we facilitate things that the local rights defenders wouldn't be able to do, and at the same time, we're really careful and cautious about the safety of them. So you probably you're not hearing much about who these rights defenders are and who these partners are, and that's for a reason, because we want to make sure that they're safe, they're still continuing in the country, and they still can do what they're doing, and they are comfortable in what they're doing, and I mean, that comes with a price. But Human Rights Watch is committed to make sure that no one's safety is at risk. And I mean, as an Afghan woman sitting here in front of you who has a voice, I'm very, very privileged to have a voice, and I am very much conscious of the privilege that I'm speaking from.
Thank you, Fereshta. Tanya, did you want to add anything, or?
Look, it's very much the same, really.
Okay, cool.
With Russian human rights defenders, those of them who still live and work inside the country, it's just not safe for them to take part in any open public events. So what we would do, likewise, is to organize public events with those partners who are already in exile, right? And then we would organize special, smallish, closed-door meetings, bringing in activists from Russia so that they could talk to the same diplomats on the same level, but privately and safely. And whenever we interact with our local partners on sensitive issues, we use a plethora of safe messengers. Those exist, and I have about 5 of them on my phone, and I constantly get lost in them because I never know like who's written what on which particular messenger, but there is absolutely no other choice. And I would say that oftentimes it's a tough call because on the one hand, we cannot afford to do any harm, and protecting our partners is paramount. On the other hand, people have agency, and sometimes they do not want to be anonymized. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they really want to speak in their own voice, using their own name, and it's a principal issue for them. And in those cases, these negotiations get to be very tough. We actually try to convince them, okay, this is not safe for you to do. Let's find another way for you to exhibit that agency in safer circumstances. So that's quite a challenge.
One of the questions I have is a very simple, practical one. When you are trying to place op-eds or when you're going and talking to diplomats, etc., very practically, how are you doing this? As in, are you sending emails to contacts that you know and saying, hey, can I come talk to you? I have this thing I need to talk to you about. And they're like, I don't have time, come next week. And you're like, no, I need to talk to you today. Or how does it, I understand you're doing the campaigns, but how does that actually work out on like a day-to-day basis?
So I mean, Human Rights Watch is this fantastic, it has a very fantastic structure in the sense that, yes, I am the only Afghanistan researcher, but I have the whole organization supporting me in the sense that, I mean, Stacy is here, right? She helps me to make sure that that the journalists see the report that I do. So we have a whole advocates structure. Especially in many cities, in most of the cities, in the capitals, we have advocates. So, for example, when I do advocacy in Geneva, I usually reach out to our Geneva director, Hillary, and then I'm like, hey, Hillary, this is a priority. That's what I did last year. I was like, hey, Hillary, Afghanistan is a high profile at this point. This is what should be done in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. Shall we talk? And then we talked, and then we strategized together. She is the one who knows all the diplomats in Geneva. And then we talk about which diplomats are important for Afghanistan. And then I give her a list. I'm like, Germany, Italy, France, all these countries who are involved in Afghanistan needs to be pushed to do more. And that's how then she reaches out to the diplomats. And she's like, and I mean, again, as always, she's like, Fereshta, my HRW colleague who is covering Afghanistan happens to be in Geneva next week, only for 2 days. And she has this report that has recently published and wants to meet and brief you on. So this is sort of how it works. And then they usually either say yes or no in those 2 days. And then we get to do, some of the meetings that we want to do. When we launch a campaign, it's a little bit different because even now, like I know some of the EU diplomats in Geneva now. Like I work very closely with Hillary, but at this point, like all of them know me. And I actually go to them and I'm like, hey, I'm going to be in Geneva around this session. Let's talk. They know. They know, and they're like, Fereshta, we know what you want to talk. And I'm like, no, I have a unique perspective this time. It is like, and we strategize. I have been consulting with this whole coalition. Like, I spoke with them 2 weeks ago and I said, see, the next session for Afghanistan is in June. I will probably go to Brussels first and then Geneva, but we need to have new arguments. We are telling the same story with new arguments, and probably Stacy is a master in that to give us new angles to do the work. But this is like the sort of that it happens. Sometimes we know the diplomats, sometimes our colleagues do, but usually our advocates are like the best point of contacts for the capitals.
Amazing. Stacy, you want to add on op-eds? Yeah.
Very, very shortly. Just that when we submit an op-ed to a paper, or just we have a lot of researchers, and sometimes we get really bad op-eds, and I will say nope, we're not going to, this needs work. We don't submit anything that is not good. And so because of that, when we do submit something, we get a response pretty quickly, and we've built up a reputation, and so they will always look, and they might pass, but there's generally a reason. So we just make sure that we give them really good stuff, which is not hard when you have the likes of, Tanya and Fereshta on your side.
Now we want to open it up to Q&A from the audience. So my colleague James has a microphone. Just raise your hand, we'll bring you a mic, and you can ask your question.
I don't like microphones. Hi. My name is Shayna Plout. I'm at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. In a previous life, I actually worked for Amnesty International many, many years ago. My question actually is the role of diasporas. Because I see. Because it's really interesting, right? It's obviously folks in country are often in a position where it may or may not be safe, and I really appreciate you talking about that challenge with agency. And then folks who are in the diaspora often will have more access, but will sometimes be discredited as, but you're in the diaspora. So, and I'm just really wondering how you negotiate that in your particular situations.
For our Afghanistan work, Afghanistan is a very complicated country to work on. There's a lot history. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of, in the sense that there is old diaspora of Afghanistan who fled during the first Taliban takeover, and there is new diaspora who came after August 2021. And there's a top-down look from the old diaspora to the new diaspora because, they speak English probably, they speak the languages with a native accent, and they have more access, and it's easier for them to access everywhere. So one of the things that we've been very conscious is to make sure that we are consulting everybody. As much as we can, not everybody, but as much as we can. So I do speak with people in Afghanistan, the rights defender in Afghanistan, and also those who are outside. So again, examples. I love examples. I arrived here on Friday at 2 p.m. I landed at 2 p.m. I went straight to a meeting with Afghan rights defenders who are leaving in Toronto in exile from 4 p.m. And I have used every an hour or opportunity to meet with Afghan rights defenders who are leaving in Toronto. I finished last night at 11 p.m. I had another meeting during lunchtime. I have another one, 3:30 right after this panel. We try to consult with them and we try to speak with them. And those who are in the diaspora are not only one who we are speaking. Not to say that some of them are my friends who have been evacuated rights, just like who I am not, just like me, who is not living in Afghanistan right now. But we try to balance the voice, because there's always a little bit tension between those who are outside and those who are inside, because those who are outside have the voice, they can be harsh, they can be as loud as they want, and those who are inside can't. So in that sense, I mean, as you mentioned, the negotiation part, we always try to ensure that we are balancing the voices. That's why I always try to I speak both languages, Dari and Pashto. I try to speak with rights defenders, not only in the big cities of Afghanistan, like Kabul, Mazar, and Herat, but also to the rural areas. So I speak with women in villages, and it usually takes I speak with people on a daily basis. We try to balance that, and that's how, one of the things that I'm confident for our Afghanistan work is that we are one of the very few organizations in Afghanistan who have access all over the country, urban and rural area, because mostly in Afghanistan, even in the past 20 years, people have had only access to the big cities. People don't really know what is happening in the rural areas. And that's puts us in a very unique situation, and people know that. So a rights defender in a small village in a part of Afghanistan who knows Human Rights Watch, they know that they can get in touch and talk to us, because we talk a lot. We talk a lot with people all over the country. And I mean, again, as I mentioned, that it is very important to balance that. So we usually try to bring diaspora in the contexts where they need to speak. I mean, you heard from Zahra. I mean, we brought her to the summit, so you can hear. And she's leading this in exile media outside Afghanistan. She has a voice, and she's the sort of individuals that we work outside Afghanistan. But I also speak with those journalists who are working on the ground, and we try to sort of balance our advocacy cost, making sure that it still reflects the voices of people in and those who are outside the country.
Any other questions? Oh, sure.
Another thing about diaspora. I mean, there are some really tricky diaspora politics to navigate sometimes, like not even just in and out, but out. There'll be diaspora, and we'll go into things cold. We did a podcast on Chagos, the last British colony, and the two diaspora groups didn't agree. And I think we had only interviewed one, and we were like, oh, that's not going to work. You know, we have to go back and get the other perspective too. And I mean, we didn't know Chagos diaspora politics. Like, this is where we have to rely on the guidance of our colleagues who do know.
Any other questions? Oh, yep, go ahead.
I don't really have a question, but just maybe an observation in the sense of, I know sort of in Australia, we have opened up, we have Ukrainians who've come to Australia. We have quite a strong Ukrainian community in Australia. So not only are you uplifting the voices, but then these communities are also continuing the conversation, because it's so easy for the next sort of terrible situation going on in the world that the conversation moves on, but they at least can in countries and their communities can keep the conversation going with the rest of different communities. And I know some of my friends are very Estonian, from background, and people like the Estonians are very supportive of people in Ukraine, because they know that Russia will just roll in and take territory. So I've actually loved that they've been very supportive of these other people in our community, knowing that what the tactic is of Russia can be. It's all about territory. So Estonians are very strong in complaining about what Putin is doing and how he needs to be stopped.
I would say that the Russian campaign is not all about territory. It is first and foremost about power and influence. And they would actually put up with a quote-unquote democratic government in a country which they know is under their influence. Like Armenia, for example, right? Armenia is in such a desperate situation, being sort of stuck in between Turkey, Azerbaijan, the two enemy countries, and Iran, that whether the government is democratic or not, whether they want it or not, they are not in a position to get by without Russia. And so the Kremlin does not exactly love Mr. Pashinyan's government in Armenia, quite the opposite, but they're putting up with it because they know that they have the power. In Ukraine, it was a very different situation. But getting back to the issue of diasporas are varied, and say, for those of you who live in the United States, I'm sure you're aware that Armenian diasporas in the United States are very big, wealthy, politically engaged, and rather powerful. Ukrainian and Belarusian diasporas in Europe have been very politically active for years and years. Russian diaspora has only grown politically active after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, whereas so many people had to flee the country for fear of political prosecution or with the criminal cases already launched against them. And among those people were top Russian researchers, top Russian writers, top Russian artists. So that completely changed the face of Russian diaspora internationally. It's very active now. But part of the problem is, like you said, that among our international interlocutors, there is oftentimes this misperception that all the good Russians, right? Everyone who is anyone in Russian civil society already left the country. So no one on the ground needs the support. Those who are on the ground, they're all with Putin, fighting Putin's war. And the only thing that needs to be done is supporting the good Russians in the diaspora. And we have to explain time and time again that, well, no, as opposed to, say, Belarus, where the repression was so staggering that pretty much all the politically active people left. In Russia, you still have some people on the ground, and they need your support more than ever.
There's a question up front.
Regarding Russia and Ukraine, about 1,000 people who were exchanged, is that a big deal, or is that just a non-event?
Look, 1,000 people exchange means 1,000 people alive. So if you ask me, people come first, and this is definitely a big deal. We don't know who, well, it's 2,000, right? So it's 1,000 for 1,000. We don't know who those people are going to be. And like I said, what we are really worried about is that in Russia, on top of Ukrainian prisoners of war, there are also thousands of those civilian detainees, or as our Ukrainian colleagues refer to them, civilian hostages, because that's what they are, essentially, right? They are civilians who were deported to Russia, locked up in Russian prisons. There are no criminal cases against them. They perpetrated no crimes. They did not attack the occupiers. They were just dragged to Russia, and they are staying there incommunicado in horrendous conditions as part of this whole exchange meat market. Well, the Russians are basically saying, we have no civilian detainees, we only have prisoners of war. And there are lots of those people. Let's see who's going to get exchanged. But frankly, this is the biggest exchange that we've seen between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces so far. And it's encouraging that those big exchanges are happening. However, our message is and has been, all the captives of the war need to be released as a priority with regard to any ongoing Ukraine-related negotiations. And we just want to see it happening, not only 1,000 for another 1,000, but all of the captives of the war.
Oh, go ahead, yeah, please.
Fereshta, this is actually a question about Afghanistan. First, congratulations on the accountability mechanism. And I realize it's probably too complex of an answer to give completely, but just trying to think about what that accountability mechanism would look like and how to scope it and how to think about accountability when there's been both like internal kind of oppression, these external forces. And I'm thinking even of like different identity-based experiences, like the Hazaras, for example, and the kind of unique oppression they faced. So can you say anything just about like the next step in terms of that defining that accountability and what type of mechanism?
Sure. Yeah, that's the question that the EU diplomats came back to us, and they were like, "You're not detailed enough. What exactly do you want?" Because so initially, I mean, strategizing with our Geneva director, initially we thought it's better to keep calling an accountability mechanism because HRC, Human Rights Council, could be as creative as they can. We said that these are the features we want. The mechanism should be able to document violations, identify perpetrators, and cooperate with criminal proceedings. And we were like, do whatever you want to do. And they came back and they were like, oh, there are problems with this and that and that. So we worked on a position paper and we submitted last week to the EU diplomats. We're calling for, it's very technical. I mean, it was new to me. I'm learning Geneva sphere. It's called IIIM. That's what we want for Afghanistan. The scope of this mechanism will be comprehensive, which means that it will document the violations that happened in Afghanistan with no time bound. The perpetrators would be the international forces on the ground that failed Afghans. The perpetrators would be the Taliban, would be the ISKP who's launching attacks against Hazaras, the former government official, which includes the report that Stacy mentioned, former Minister of Interior, policemen who sexually abuse their colleagues on job. So, and that's why it's difficult to get that, because everybody's hand is sort of involved there, right? But that's the sort of mechanism that we want for Afghanistan. And that's why I say that if we get it this September, it is going to be a historic moment for Afghanistan. And I have actually bet on it. I have told the EU diplomat who's drafting it, and I was like, if you do this, we will have a champagne at the Human Rights Council celebrating it.
Amazing. And I'll just say a small thing, which I feel is so small compared to the big systemic work that you guys are doing. Way downstream on the communications end, we talked a little bit about agency. On the podcast, one of the things that you'll see is I laugh a lot on the podcast because that is my personality, but also there's a specific thing that we're trying to do, that I am trying to do in Amplifying Voices. So I did international development in graduate school, and then I went through a long law process, and I came back to this work. And one of the things that I've observed in a lot of our human rights storytelling is that often the people who are going through experiences, they're very, very flat, boring characters. And it's this sort of difficult thing where you're trying to communicate something very intense, but we as receivers of stories are sort of like, that person's going through it, that they went through a hardship that's like this other hardship, that's like this other hardship. The world is hard.
You mean that they're victims, not people?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. That they're victims and not people. And so one of the sort of strategies in the way that we communicate is I very intentionally try to ask people things about what they do in their life. Your hobbies, what's your culture like, etc. Because we're trying to make it so that it's not a victim, it is a person who has complexity and is round. They have conflicting interests. They're humans like the rest of us are. And bringing those elements in, they're very backstage. You don't really notice them, but it helps the communication to be like, oh, this is a person that I can empathize with, and then when I hear the story, then I can connect to it. So I think it's like there's from the biggest, most intense things to like the small kind of story things feel like different ways that we're attacking the same problem.
You also make them laugh sometimes, which is also just so nice to hear. I'm in the Congolese diaspora, and so one of the experiences is knowing that together with suffering, there's often always, at least in our context, so much
there's suffering and then there's laughter, and it's weird if they don't live together, and we try to like braid those things. That is the end of our session. Thank you so much for your time. Fereshta, yeah, go ahead.